So today is about GTAP WiNDC, sort of about modeling, economic modeling with this. And sort of my objective, there's always this frustration with short courses that I always feel as though I find it challenging to cover all these topics in a semester, let alone a week. And so there's always this tendency to sort of rush through the week, and it's really hard to assess, to provide much guidance for learning. It's like it's difficult. So this year I decided we'd do three separate topics, 3 days, three separate topics, and just much the way Jim did yesterday, just give you pointers to where the materials are that you can do self-learning. And so that's the objective here. And today is like, okay, we have a model. How do we run this, right? What's the use of it? But I want to begin by just recapping a few ideas from yesterday. And mainly, I just want to sort of give a perspective on sort of Matheson's framework and sort of recap of that. And then, so I have several things to cover. Let me begin by saying going through this quote from Pascal from 1656. I apologize, but I didn't have time to write a short letter. So I apologize for not taking the time to write a short lecture, right? I have too many slides. Right? So this is this idea of looking at frameworks for understanding economic policy. And that's the objective today, is to sort of get some pointers on how to do that with GAMS. And but I'll begin by sort of going through Matheson's modeling framework. I can't avoid talking a bit about MPSGE because this is something that we lean on heavily in the project for doing modeling. And to be honest, you have a model, you can write it down in GAMS algebra, or you can write it down in MPSG. They're exactly equivalent. It's just the MPSG method is shorter, less prone to error, and more likely to catch mistakes that you make, right? So so we tend to rely on that. Typically, anytime we do a release of the WiNDC framework, we do it algebraically and with MPSG. So I'll go through a little bit of Matheson's modeling framework. I'll talk very briefly about MPSG. I'll point you to some materials, and I provided some materials, some lecture notes on CES functions. They're just basically for your reference. And then I'll talk about the main topic is today is sort of simulation analysis with GAMS and Excel. So how do we have a model that's set up in GAMS on the shelf. How do we take it off the shelf and run it? But I'll begin this morning with, and just to emphasize, Matheson's framework is very general. It provides a framework for doing partial or general equilibrium models. It's for static or dynamic models. It's a very general sort of framework. And so we'll begin very simple with this simple partial equilibrium model, optimal sanctions, and we'll go through that and show how to take a model off the shelf, calibrate it to data, and do simulations and look at the results. So that's the idea, is sort of how do I take something off the shelf and use it? And that'll be sort of, I have a basic model set up and operational, but we'll do this together. We'll go through the process of, okay, so we're going to set up some simulations and look at the results. And then this afternoon, we'll come back to WiNDC. I'll talk a little about WiNDC origins and motivation. We'll go through the basic equations of the model, how that's structured, and then we'll look at a policy application there with tariff quota replacement of the Trump tariffs on steel. So this is looking at sort of how do we take a model, again, off the shelf and modify it. It's a bit of a challenge because here I know that a lot of people like to have a model that's well documented, has lots of features in it. You can pull it off the shelf, find out what switches to run, and then do the switches and do the simulations and get the results back. That's what we affectionately refer to as a padded cell. So if you want to have a padded cell, unfortunately, I'm not very good at providing padded cells. I much prefer to have a generic model sitting on the shelf that I understand inside out exactly how it all works. And so if somebody comes to me with a policy simulation, I take my model off the shelf and I modify it to do the simulation I want to do, and I do the simulation to get the numbers back. So that's a sort of a challenge here about, how much you have to know about things. And so I'll try to go through an example to show how that works. And I think that the tariff quota simulation is the classic example, whereas tariff quotas are a little bit complicated. You have to know what the in quota tariff rate is, what the quota limit is on in quota trade, and you have to know what the out of quota. So there's a lot of details there that if you were to put all of those details into a model that's just sitting on the shelf, then you'd have a pretty heavy model and would be prone to error because you have so many varieties. But if you have a generic model and you understand the tariff quota structure, it's pretty simple to put in. So that'll be the afternoon. So that's my objective for today, is if I can get through these two examples and point you to the material you need for learning this stuff. I think that's the key sort of, I will feel like I've accomplished what I set out to do today. So this goes back to Matheson's framework, and I just want to recap this. Jim went through this very nicely yesterday, but I just like to provide a framework, and I also just want to sort of give you a sense about how this works. Matheson's 85 paper, essentially you only have to read 2 or 3 pages of it. That's the main, in my view, the main thing he delivered was a very concise modeling framework, which the framework he basically borrowed from SCARF. And so he basically shows this works, but what's more important is he shows not only is this framework very easy to write down models, but it actually is operational. We can come up with an algorithm that can solve these models. So that idea that you could solve things was really quite forward-looking and really remarkable. A lot of his, the longevity of that contribution is largely due to Michael Ferris, who came up with a very powerful algorithm for solving this class of models. And so his contribution was really is significant because of and he's a computer scientist who's open-minded and happy to learn about all sorts of stuff, including economics. So he spent a year at Colorado when he was working on this when I was there, and so this contribution is really important. But so this is not just Matheson's framework, but also Ferris's code that really makes this baby hum, right? So this is the key idea. So this notion here was, and this again was, and it's sort of an incestuous, or it's a group of people who are all sort of connected, because SCARF's student when he was writing the monograph was Terje Lensberg, who had been a docent or a sort of a graduate student at the Norwegian School of Economics and advised Lars Matheson on his master's thesis. So Lars, when he met Terje, Lars was working on models for fisheries, right? So the Norwegians were way ahead. They were thinking about, in the 80s, they were thinking about how to optimally feed salmon. And so they have these interesting growth curves, and Matheson was working on that. And Lensberg came along to him and said, well, maybe you should think about a little bit bigger question than just how to feed salmon. Let's look at economic equilibrium. So Terje was instrumental in getting Lars started on that work. And this recognition that there's this complementarity problem, which was invented not by George Dantzig, but by Dantzig's student, Dick Cottle, basically invented this problem class. And it's a problem class that encompasses first order conditions for optimization problems. So if you take an optimization problem and write down the first order conditions where the problem may have boundaries on it, may have inequalities that may or may not be binding, this problem subsumes all of those first order conditions, but then can be generalized to many more applications than just that, including lots of applications in game theory and traffic equilibrium and electricity networks. There's lots of things where this is useful. So the canonical general equilibrium model, let's see if I can hide this guy, hide floating medium controls. The canonical equilibrium problem that Matheson goes through is this idea that we want to find a set of prices, and that's so the vector prices in Lars's notation are variables. There's a vector of endowments, which is given, and this in B sub I is the endowment of good I. And then you have a demand function, which is a vector of demands for each of the goods, D sub I. That's a point-to-point mapping. You put in a price, you get back a price. And then you have a vector of activity levels, and that's where, so the underlying equilibrium problem will be a point-to-set problem because we don't know which of these activity levels will be active. And then he talks about a matrix of price responsive input-output coefficients. So this matrix, in Jim's framework, if we rely on Shepard's lemma, then that matrix is derived from the zero profit conditions. But Matheson just says, okay, we have a matrix that's price responsive. It may or may not, he doesn't tie himself down to a particular representation. And so this basically, his format follows chapter 5 of Scarf's monograph. So this is the basic sort of idea here. And so in monograph in equilibrium, it says no activity earns a positive profit. No commodity is in excess demand. So net supply, which is initial endowments plus produced output, net produced output, has to be greater than or equal to final demand. And no prices or activity levels are negative. So those guys are all non-negative. And then an activity earning a deficit is not used, and an operated activity has no loss. So we have this complementary slackness condition. And then there's this final thing is this this complementary slackness condition, both for activities, says that there may be activities which are available but not operated because they don't break even, and there also are goods which may be in excess supply. So the canonical example there I like to use is if we're talking about, like today, it's going to be 90 degrees in Madison. So somebody, no doubt in Madison, there are lots of snow shoveling services around. None of those are active today. And likewise, if you come back in January, there are lots of kids who could be running lemonade stands, and those are not operating in the winter. So that's sort of akin to there being, and the applications are many. The classic application is in electricity dispatch. We have solar powered generation on days that it's sunny. They're going to produce power because it's basically free for them to produce it. On sunny days, no matter what the price is, they're not going to break even. So basically, this is a very general class. It turns out that if you show that Walras law applies, which means the inner product of P with B minus D is equal to 0, then if that's true, so if the demand functions exhibit or satisfy Walras law, then the complementary slack conditions need not be applied as part of the equilibrium condition. So in the thing, the complementary slackness is a feature, not a requirement of equilibrium. That was a question that came to me from Curtis Eves during my thesis defense in 1986 or 1987. And I didn't answer it until a paper I published in 2001. So I like these problems that you get and you sort of keep them for a long time. So that's kind of a nice little feature of that thing. So you can think about the A sub i's as arising from profit maximization, and the D's as arising from utility maximization. So if that's the case, then that's one way of having the model specified. Or it may be that these guys, they could be arbitrary. So we can also have a partial equilibrium model where we don't have any restrictions on how things are defined, and that's also okay. It turns out that for general equilibrium, this is almost always the case, that these guys come from maximization, in which case there's an additional structure on these guys. And furthermore, this inner product of P and A is simply equal to the revenue function minus the cost function. So there's a nice sort of microeconomic interpretation of that. But anyway, so that's a nice, so that's sort of some observations about these guys. So one of the things that we deal with here is we have taxes that show up in the model. And so these tax distortions come in. And so tax distortions influence both the primal and the dual side of the model. And taxes are one thing that introduce what's known as skew symmetry into the demand system. So therefore, we move out of the class of first order conditions for an optimization problem and into a true equilibrium problem when we have taxes, because there's not an optimization problem that independently defines the equilibrium. So here's an example of what the zero unit profit condition looks like in the general equilibrium households H. And you can write down the profit of activity J is the inner product of prices and net put vector minus the set of unit tax payments. So this is a very compact way of writing down the equilibrium condition. That's just, I'm just giving you this is a very compact way of writing down what it's going to be. That guy's non-negative. And then once you have those in the model, then you need to keep track of what the revenues are. So that tax will feed into the, so here is the, where's it go here? I need to put my glasses on. Yeah, so with taxes, you say tax revenue plus net put, value of net put has to be non-positive. No commodities in excess demand. You have this complementarity, and then in addition, you have income levels that define in the sort of with taxes, you have to keep track of where in the general equilibrium setting, you have to keep track of what tax revenues are. And so here's the tax revenue from activity J that's paid to household H. And so you need to sum in, so to have closure of the flows, you need to keep track of all the tax revenue. And that's one of the things that we get here. So that's just, I'm just giving you, that's the basic framework, and that captures all of these models. So this is a very nice way to capture all this stuff in one setting. So if we look at Jim's example, he had went through a nice example yesterday where he had, he was highlighting the difference between a model where you have a tax instrument or some sort of quota to achieve a given objective. And so, you know, this is, the economics of this is interesting. I'm just pointing out that the framework, this framework is very general. So you take his model that he gave, we have non-negative variables. If we want to cast this in Matheson's framework, we distinguish between which variables are activities, which variables are prices, and then because it's general equilibrium, we also have an income level. So that gives us our general equilibrium model. We have to keep track of each activity then has a zero profit condition. Each market has a market clearance condition, or each price has a market clearance condition, and each household has an income balance constraint. We write down the model, then we associate which, to get the complementary slackness assigned as to which variables are complementary with which equations, we do this association. And that's one of the things that's sort of a mystery about how this works so well. As I noted, if we have Walras law satisfied, then the equilibrium conditions imply this, but it turns out that one of the tricks to how these solve so well is that you have to do, when you give it this association, then that feature of the equilibrium tends to give you a better performance on the algorithm. So that's one of the things that we get here. So if we're going to write this down using Matheson's framework, it's helpful to write down elements of these A vectors, D vectors, and tau. And that's here, I'm going to write down the intermediate inputs, and this is going to be I underscore PL to X is going to represent the input of PL into sector X, input of PK into sector X, the output from sector X into the PX market. And likewise, so you can represent all of these net put vectors using, you can come up with a notation to represent that. And then that gives you a very nice clean representation of the equilibrium. So I'm using those in GAMS, you can define macros can represent simple string substitution. So once I've done the substitution, then it's easy to see that the equilibrium conditions I'm writing down for GAMS are indeed exactly equivalent to what Matheson write down, because this is going to be A transpose pi is going to be this set of net put vectors times the prices. Market clearance conditions are going to be Y times A. And then we have these elements of the final demand, or L bar and D bar. And then we have final demand. Anyway, so this gives you the market clearance, and those have easily sort of interpreted. Yeah, so you can give an argument to the macro. Yeah, and you'll see an example of that. Yeah, so the macro gives you a way of doing a substitution. And what I'm trying to do here, maybe this is sort of too pedantic, but I like to make a direct relationship between how the GAMS code is written down and what Matheson's framework is. So in his framework, remember, we have B, the initial endowment. We have A is the matrix of price responsive coefficients, and D are the final demand vectors. And that's exactly what we have in the scalar example that shows here. So here we assign initial values. We set the iteration limit to 0, which is just a shorthand in GAMS MCP of saying to the solver, don't touch the values I give you, just evaluate the functions and come back and tell me how good my evaluation is. And then we can then check this function, this GAMS function called round, rounds a numerical value to a specified number of decimals. So here I round it to 3 decimals, and I say, if it's less than 3 decimals, that's close enough for government work. Otherwise, stop it. So if we're not, yeah. So that says that, okay, so if it's not precise enough, then alert the user that we have and this is the way it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition that the model makes sense. But it's always a good idea when you work with a calibrated equilibrium to like, let's double check that we understand the model. And at the very least, the model should be able to replicate the reference point where we're calibrating stuff. So that gives me that calibration point. Yeah.
So we have this L notation after the variable, and that's acceptable, right?
That sets the level.
Level. Okay. So then L bar above is what? In the previous slide. Parameter, right? For what? So slide 23.
Let's see, 23. L bar is going to be the labor. That should have been lower. That should have been labor. That's labor demand and labor supply. Let's look at this model. And I can send this around. So there's the MCP model. And that should have been lowercase. I like to follow Michael Saunders. I knew Michael very well. I used to play squash with him when I was a graduate student. A good guy. Extremely laconic, like, you know, it's like talking to Eeyore. The guy's hilarious. But man, he's a great squash player, but he made a hell of a contribution to math programming. So his Minos solver for optimization was the first large scale sparse matrix nonlinear solver that was really good. He was the Bartel-Golub update. He was a Bartel student, and then he basically stayed at Stanford and worked in the systems optimization lab. So he gets lots of problems. People would submit GAMS code and say, my model doesn't work. And he wouldn't accept the model unless you followed that notation. He wants to see the variables to be uppercase, the data to be lowercase, so that way he can tell what's a variable and what's a parameter. Right? So that's what we have here, and that gives us our example. And this is here. I've just written down the model, so that gives my model, and I can say then GAMS MCP model, and that gives me the solution. If we look at the solution here, so there's all the solution values, and here you can see the level value, the lower bound, and the upper bound. And so here I've assigned one price to normalize prices. So I set PW equal to 1. And notice that over here on the marginal for PW, this is what Jim was pointing out very nicely yesterday. The marginal tells us what the slack variable is in that equation. And so we see that the omitted equation still goes out and evaluates the thing. And EPS means it's a small number. It's not exactly 0, but it's very, very close to 0. And then all the other ones have dots, which says that the solver came back telling it it's essentially 0. So the solver says, it doesn't tell you exactly what the value is, but the dot indicates the solver told GAMS this is within the prescribed tolerance. So GAMS writes as a dot just to let you know that it's small, but it doesn't know exactly what the number is. And so you have the upper bound and lower bound and the level values. And so the lower bound is going to be this guy. This guy is going to be dot low. This one would be dot L, and this guy is going to be dot up, and this guy is going to be dot M. Right, so it's going to tell, that's what comes back. And so you think about the solve statement in GAMS is essentially an operation on a database. It simply says, okay, I've given you my model. I've declared the model, I've given you the model. Do an operation on the database for that model. Take the logic of the equations, go off and solve the model, and come back and load for me what the level values are at the solution. I've given it the lower bound and the upper bound are model inputs. The level value and the marginal are model outputs. So we say to the solver, take this thing, well, solve the model, come back and give me the stuff back. And so then GAMS is this fascinating sort of combination of both declarative and procedural features. So a declarative feature is sort of like when you do Excel, is largely a declarative language. you say cell A2 is equal to cell C1 plus cell D7. So you write down the declarations, and Excel just makes sure the declares are satisfied. In GAMS, you get the declarative structure is the model, and then you say solve is like saying update my spreadsheet, and it loads everything in. And then at that point, you can do procedural things with the solution. So that's what gives you, what makes GAMS ultra powerful is you have this combination of this ability to do operations on a model you specify, and then to do stuff with the solution that comes back. So that's what we have. And that's the reason GAMS is a challenge for new users, because people who are typical GAMS users are sort of already up the learning curve on how to do the procedural stuff. And so it's very rare that we have a padded cell GAMS model where everything's locked down. It's typically, we have some logic there. This has got some stuff. Oh yeah, I've done that simulation. Here, I dumped the stuff out there, and you get someone's code, and it may not be like it's all tight. It's actually just, it's something that's continuously in revision. So, and that's the way Alex would always talk about GAMS as being, it's a model prototyping language, right? So it's basically for generating the prototype of the model you want. And indeed, for GAMS was originally developed at the World Bank, but then it was quickly taken up by a refinery scheduling guys, and they would prototype their refinery scheduling model. Once they got it running, then they would dump GAMS and take the model they had done and then do a call directly to the solver to do it without using the GAMS system, because they could get it to run faster. Okay, so GAMS is a prototyping environment, and that's the challenge, I think, for GAMS in policy settings, is that we'd like to keep all these features, but then if you keep all the features, then the model gets hopelessly complicated, and then the likelihood of making a mistake goes up. And so that means that the best way to use GAMS is to have the model, have a canonical model sitting on the shelf, and every application is a new application. You may go back through your archive of applications you've done before and pull some features in and do this, and you know how to do it. But that presumes that you have someone in-house who knows how to do that. And that's what the challenge is. And I'm not sure what the answer is for that. I mean, it's hard. That part is hard. So there's our model. This should have been lowercase. I'll try to correct that in the next round. Let me just move this guy over. I want to avoid going too fast. And that's always my problem, is I just race through stuff. And part of this stuff is just my format. This OBJ val, that was my request to Alex in 1988. I said, I want to get an index back of the precision. I want to have it be the syntax in MCP, meaning if I set 0, there's a new syntax that says like max in fees and average in fees. So there's ways you can get other reports back. I don't know those guys. I just know this one. But there are different ways you can get stuff back. So just, again, I don't have time this week or today to use it to teach MPSG, but I can point you to MPSG. And so that's my next topic, will be MPSG, just sort of a helicopter tour of how this works, so you can see.
I could send you around. I did this in Kyiv. In Ukraine, I took the MCP model and showed an exact copy of it from MPSG, and the slides went through all the way things. So
yeah,
actually it's a nice.
No, that'd be great to have another one. I'm going to go through this model I showed you here. I'm going to show you the MPSG version of this one, because part of the reason is that the version of, yeah, I'd love to see that. That'd be good. The GTAP WiNDC model I run today, I only have it running MPSG, so you have to be aware that there's this other format. My experience has been that MPSG is like an ultra powerful tool in the hands of someone who's skilled with it. Sort of like MPSG is sort of like a lightsaber for Jedis, right? If you know what you're doing, you can really do a lot. But if you don't know what you're doing, you're likely to cut your arm off, right? So it's like, that's the challenge, is that it's like, so most of our time in WiNDC, our frameworks, anytime we do a sub-release, we always code up the model both in algebra and in MPSG. And so if people are beginning, I recommend use the algebraic model. You can see it, but we always do all of our prototyping is done with MPSG. So MPSG is this ultra cryptic thing that was developed sort of a tool for a specific class for air-to-brew general equilibrium models. The main thing it's delivering for you is it keeps track of the income accounting. That's really where the problem is. You want to put lots of taxes in, but you want to keep track of who gets the revenue. And if you do this algebraically, it gets really messy because you got to keep track of where things go, whereas MPSG will keep track of that. It has this automated calibration stuff, which I'll explain momentarily and sort of how that works. But so that's the advantages of it, are that it keeps track of stuff. It makes the problem representation is very compact. So you get everything on the one page. So something that the algebra for a typical GTAP model spans about 8 pages, and it's messy and has lots of stuff. MPSG, it gets compressed into one page, so you can see everything in one shot, but it's non-algebraic. So you have to sort of understand what the syntax is. My mother was she had a master's degree in industrial psychology, and her master's advisor says, Marilyn, you have to learn how to type your thesis, but when you go into industry, never tell anyone you know how to type. That was his advice to a professional woman in 1950, right? So that's like, and then the other thing that she told me she never would tell people that she knew how to do was she was very good at this. Her shorthand was extremely good. So basically, when people were talking, she could write exactly what they're writing down using shorthand. And then she would have to take the shorthand and type it up. And I saw her do it, but she never would tell people she was doing. She knew what she was doing. So she would always be careful not to show people. And the same thing goes with MPSG. MPSG is sort of like shorthand for writing out a model, which means that if you know it, it's very useful, but it's not very useful to show your shorthand to other people, right? Because if you show it to someone like, there are people in the game who basically will try to take you down because say you're using MPSG, so therefore the equation, I can't read the equations, so nothing you do, I don't trust anything you're doing because it's not right. Right? And there are people in the profession, that's their attitude, is like, if you use this, then you don't. Whereas, in fact, my view is the other way. If you know the MPSG, then you really know what you're doing, is my view. So it's basically a routine for providing supply and demand functions, price responsive and analytic Jacobians, provides background checks for model consistency. It gives you a very short rope to hang yourself with. So as soon as you hang yourself, it's going to capture you before something bad happens. It goes back to Lars Mathiessen's visit to Stanford in 1981. He was a really great visitor. I worked on my master's thesis was with him. I developed this code. It was really not, I can't pretend that I was so smart and understand this. I was just a master's student, but I was good at programming. So I could take, John Tomlin had this LCPL code for Lemke's algorithm, and Michael Saunders, who I played squash with, had this good factorization system. He was happy to let me use it. So I basically married 2 pieces of code together. And suddenly Lars had this algorithm for solving these problems that he thought he was on top of the world because he could solve 20 equations. And at that time, the best fixed point codes could do 15 equations. But the thing is, I discovered that most of the problems that arose were because they weren't doing a careful job of factorization. They weren't doing a careful job of constructing the Jacobian. They're using numerical differencing. So when I put together Miles's code, the Miles combined LCPL with LUSOL, suddenly we went from 15 equations, we could go to 300 equations. This was like this enormous realization, and man, we had some real horsepower going that nobody else knew about, and it was just fantastic. So I went to visit Lars in February of '82, mainly because he was such a damn good cross-country skier. I really want to learn how to cross-country ski as well as he did. I didn't really know what I was going to do with my master's degree, but I went there thinking I was going to learn how to ski. I learned that Bergen, it rained more than it snowed, and getting up to the snow it was a long train ride. And also the couple of times I went, I discovered that I really didn't know how to ski. By Norwegian standards, I was awful, right? And so it was kind of humbling. But when I joined the basketball club, I discovered I was pretty good at basketball by Norwegian standards. So I ended up playing basketball rather than skiing. And I ended up staying for a year to play basketball. And so that was really what I did my PhD largely because I ended up playing basketball. That's mainly what I didn't intend to do this, but before I knew it, we had this thing running, and it was good, right? So basically, in this project that they employed me at Handels High School, I developed this tool mainly because I found these guys were ultra smart economists. Agnar Sandmo, man, just a great guy and ultra smart. Victor Norman is the one who taught me what a unit function was. I didn't understand this, and he basically explained all the stuff I did with MPSG was basically came from this project. And we developed this standardized set of routines because I got so annoyed with the economists always changing their mind about what the functional form should be, that I thought, I want to do this once and not worry about it. And so I went as a master's student, I went and presented this at the TIMS conference in 1984. The audience had, there were 3 people in the audience when I first presented this, so it's a relatively modest contribution. After that, I learned, I met Alex Miros. I gave you a site here, a quote from Alex, which is great. And I suddenly realized, man, Alex was like way miles ahead of me in terms of what they were doing. So I early on, I wanted to team up with Alex. And so I basically followed his stuff, and I convinced Alex to help me work with GAMS. So in '89, we took this version of MPSG and hooked it up to GAMS. And then he was willing to help me with the MPSG hookup, provided that we produced an algebraic link to my solver for MCPs. That was the horse trading that went on here. Is I gave him the time to get the MCP stuff running, and he gave me the time to figure out how to get MPSG to work in that framework. And so that was the framework. And then it was, I think in '94, I met Ferris, and Ferris then proceeded to completely snow. My solver for MCP was good, but Ferris's solver was way, way better. So I basically got out of that game at that point. Basically Ferris took over. But just to show you what an MPSG model looks like, so I'll just show you what the previous model I went through in MCP. What does this look like in MPSG? And I have to show you this because if you work with WiNDC, this is a helpful way to sort of be aware that this exists. Even if you don't use it, it's helpful to be aware this exists. So in MPSG, first of all, we tell GAMS, hey, don't look at this. We're going to do this behind your backs. We say on text, which tells GAMS, you're not going to know what we're doing. We're just doing this ourselves. So don't bug us. We're going off to do our own sort of specification. And then we say, okay, in an MPSG model, not only you declare non-negative variables, but you declare what you classify the variables. So you say, we're going to have a class of variables that represent sectors. That's the Y variables in the Mathiesen framework. We're going to have commodities. Each commodity has a corresponding price. That's the P variables in Mathiesen's framework. And then we have consumers, and those are the M variables in the Mathiesen framework. So we have income levels for consumers, we have prices for commodities, and we have sectors. So that's all there. And then we go forward to this specification of technology and preferences and endowments, which follows Mathiesen's framework, but it's kind of cryptic. It says, okay, I'm going to have a production function corresponding to sector X. The elasticity of substitution in this function is 1. It says this one's going to be Cobb-Douglas. When the activity level of, when X dot L is equal to 1, when the activity level is 1, then this sector produces an output in the PX market, which is 100 divided by 1 plus TC. So that's the output. And then says at the reference point, that's when prices of the inputs are both equal to 1, I have an input, the optimal input is of PL is going to be 25 and the optimal input of PK is going to be 75. So I'm giving it a point on the isoquant. I'm going to come back to that, explain how this works momentarily with a little graphical interface, but to show you, but that's the basic sort of syntax. And so MPSG is this tabular format. I think I came up with this largely because I took George Danzig's course in linear programming, and I thought Danzig's contribution to the simplex algorithm was kind of cool, relatively intuitive, neat. But I was really impressed by was Orchard Hayes. Orchard Hayes is a name that no one knows, but in math programming, he was the programmer who followed Danzig around and implemented all the stuff that Danzig talked about. So Orchard Hayes was the one who developed, and Orchard Hayes was the first one to recognize linear programming is fine, but we should have one standard syntax for what a linear programming model looks like. And once you have the syntax, then you can change from one solver to another without changing the model specification. And so that was the idea of MPSG, was let's have one syntax for the model specification. We can turn around and offer the model to different solvers to solve it. And so that was my idea with this, was to develop a model class that made it easy to switch between solvers. Essentially what it does is it turns the solver into a commodity. It's like you're the modeler in charge now, the solver is not in charge. Before, if you have one solver, then he tells you all sorts of details about how the model has to be provided to him, and you're following his rules. As soon as you have the model in this framework, then the model solver it has nowhere to go. He has to use the format. And that's essentially what GAMS provides. So this is the model specification in MPSG, gives you a very clean way of writing down the model. Okay, so one of the things we get, and this again, now this is something that Jim doesn't cover because he wants to keep the algebra simple, which I completely understand. But if we're going to do empirics, then we have to have more flexibility than just Cobb-Douglas. And so that's where we have CES functions. So here is a CES technology. Here are 3 different specifications of a CES functional form. There's the minimum number of parameters is simply 1 a sub I for each input I. Or you can have a set of share parameters alpha, and you can have a scale parameter phi. Or you can add, so here we have 2n plus 1 parameters, which seems like it's kind of wasteful in terms of parameters. But if we have this format, then we have a much more flexible specification because we have value shares at the reference point, we have a reference point, and we have an output level. So if I want to, I can go to my, I included this in the distribution. And again, people have probably seen this before. I've had this around for 20 years, I guess, but this is this gives you this sort of teaches you what is how does an equilibrium model work. So here we have x0 is the reference value of x. Px0 is the reference price of x. Sigma is the elasticity of substitution, which is a free parameter. Epsilon is the elasticity of demand, the overall demand elasticity. Px is the counterfactual price of x, and Py is the counterfactual price of y. So we have some free parameters that the benchmark is we can change the elasticity of substitution, and that flattens out the isoquant, right? So that gives us, that changes how the isoquant operates. And we have an elasticity of demand, which doesn't change anything at the reference point because it's all calibrated to the demand at that point. So changing the elasticity of demand does not change anything at the reference point. But if I then go in and say, okay, well, let's change what the price of x is, that's going to move the point. So as I move here, I have the benchmark indifference curve, which is here, and then I have the counterfactual indifference curve that goes there. So if I change the aggregate demand elasticity, if I make that go higher, then the demand response, as the price of x rises, the demand response is going to be greater. So I both have a substitution response along the isoquant, and I have a demand response, which is moving in and out. Again, being sort of a nerdy engineering by nature, I like this format for explaining it because I find it much better than having lots of carefully documented math. Because now if you're curious about this, everything is there. All of the stuff is given here. If you want to know how this operates, there are the exogenous inputs, there are the implicit inputs that calculate. Here are all the points on the isoquant, on the demand point. So everything is given there. So if you're curious about how this works, nothing is hidden. Now, the key thing, if I go back to the price being 1, the key point is that here I can change what x0 is. So I can move x0 to be smaller, or I can move it to be bigger. So this other format, if I go back to my lecture notes, this format down here where I have both a value share and I have x, this is very helpful because I can drive the function, I can move where my calibration point is without having the algebra, the functional form, move around. So this is a very convenient format. I'll just say I've included here for those of you who are tire biters, if you really want to know about this, you can go and read cestechnology.pdf for my lecture notes on CES functional forms technologies. And then there's more ces.demand, which has got a nice, this is basically just this begins with a calibrated CES demand. And so this begins with, this is all motivated by a word problem. So Thomas lives in Ann Arbor. He currently spends 30% of his income on rent. He gets an employment offer in Zurich where his income goes up by 50%, right? Which is more than he currently, but he's hesitant to move because rental rates in Zurich are 3 times higher in Zurich than they are in Ann Arbor. So the question I have for my students always is, he has CS preferences. Should he move? So do we know? And the answer is, we don't know, because it depends on preferences, right? If he wants to live in exactly the same size house in Zurich, so he wants to be able to afford, if we want to use a revealed preference argument to say, yeah, he wants to move, then he needs a 60% increase in salary, not a 50% increase, because he can't live the same way in Zurich that he does in Ann Arbor, because it's too expensive to live that way, right? The house is too big. American houses are ridiculously large, right? So it depends. So he needs a 60%. So therefore and it comes down to this diagram that says that here's where he's living today. There's the elasticity of substitution. This is the new budget line. At the new budget line, he can't afford the original consumption point, but it's whether or not, if his difference curve at A exactly is tangent at B to the new budget line, then he's indifferent between moving. If the elasticity is higher than that point, then he's going to be happy to move. If the elasticity is lower than that, he doesn't want to move, right? So that's the reason I like CS functions, because it's sort of the minimal format you need to get some interesting economics going, where you don't know, it's going to depend on the elasticity. So of course, you'd rather have all this stuff be empirically estimated. So there are lots of things, but at the very least, we have to be able to represent that. And so that's when we get, if we use CS functions, then the beauty is that we can represent these variety of choices. Okay. Well, I guess at that point, we're coming up. Are there any questions at this point on stuff? I'm going kind of fast. I don't know if there are people out there in lecture land. Okay. So let's do a model. Okay. And here I want to use a model. I want to, let's just do a partial equilibrium model. No, less detail, more just about the format. And let's do a model that is real. And the thing is, I would posit that the CES gives you lots of machinery for looking at interesting policy questions without a lot of detail. And so we're going to say, let's look at a model where we have regions. Region R produces a good. It's going to be crude oil. C doesn't correspond to crude oil. Crude oil is going to be the marginal, that's the producer price. So that's how much the producer gets per output. And so here I'm using a calibrated share. I'm using a calibrated functional form where Y bar is the reference level of output and C sub R is going to be the reference supply price. And C sub R at the reference point is going to be equal to 1. So I'm calibrating it so C bar sub R is equal to 1. And so then I have two free parameters. One is going to be the benchmark supply Y bar. And then there's going to be the benchmark price elasticity of supply eta sub R. Right? So that gives me a supply model. And so I have a degree of flexibility there about how price responsive is that supply. So we can say if we're Saudi Arabia, the price elasticity is very low, right? Could be Canada, the price elasticity could be higher. So it depends on how. The problem we have is that oil producers got burned really bad during COVID, so they don't want to, there's not as much venture capital floating around for fracking. And there's also Wisconsin, you know, is the Saudi Arabia fracking sand. Almost all the fracking sand comes from deposits here in Wisconsin, because you need to have, to frack, you need to have very uniformly sized sand aggregates that are perfectly spherical. And so that it turns out that Wisconsin is the place where you come to get that stuff, right? And so, in fact, the funny thing is, if you listen here on, I think it was Thursdays at noon, back when, before the pandemic, almost Thursday, they would shut down University Avenue for like 20 minutes while the train would go by. and the train was full of cars of fracking sand. So that during the boom era, these days there's not as much, so there's been a noticeable decline. But I always thought that was kind of quaint about Madison. They would shut everything down so that they could bring the fracking sand through. So that's a debate. You wouldn't feel them here, but that was an issue with the, yeah. So that's where they're using the sand. Here they're just mining the stuff, but yeah. So now we have regional demand, and now this is going to be P sub R, which will be the price of oil products. We're going to think about the model being having both a supply and demand side for oil. So we have the demand is going to be the reference demand, which will be D bar times PR. And again, the reference, we're calibrating this so that the reference price is 1 in all cases. And then finally, we're going to, so that those are both Marshallian elasticities. And we could just as easily write these as linear as well as isoelastic, right? So that you could write down a linear demand, a linear function that would capture supply and demand just as well. And now we then go to the sort of the CS part of the model. And the CS part of the model is going to capture this idea that oil produced in different regions are imperfect substitutes. So there's not one market for oil, but each oil is characterized by at least 2 different characteristics. You know, the specific gravity, light versus, and then whether or not it's the sulfur content. So both those things, is it sweet or sour? So we're going to appeal to that idea that there's differences in the characteristics of oil to represent this choice. And then this then will calibrate the choice, the demand in the model to be X sub R to R prime. So that's the supply from region R to region R prime. It's going to be the reference supply times the price of the oil composite divided by the supply price, the delivered price of the good. And delivered price is going to be the producer price in R times 1 plus the tax rate. Okay. And to make the model as simple as possible, I don't want to calibrate. I haven't brought in anything about what the costs are, the component costs are of refineries, but I'm going to make this brave and brazen assumption that we can neglect the other costs going in. The refinery, it's capital intensive, but it's relatively, most of the cost of the oil, of the product is in the crude oil, and we can neglect that. So you could check that assumption. We could go back and look for data, but initially I'm just going to make this, because that makes the model very, very simple. And so if I have this demand function, the corresponding, if you go back to on the dual side, the corresponding cost index is going to be when CR prime is equal to 1 and tau sub R prime to R is equal to 0, then these guys sum up to 1, and therefore the product prices are all calibrated to 1. So this gives us a calibrated supply function where we have the relevant inputs are going to, oh, there shouldn't be a bar over here. That should just be theta sub R to R prime is the benchmark exports, value share of exports. So there's some notational glitches in this thing. So that gives us our model. So let's go in and look at our model. And then, of course, we have a model. And again, it's always the case. You're setting up models. So you want to basically make the model as complicated as you need for the question at hand, but no more complicated than that. And so there's always this tendency to make things complicated. That's going to be my whole model. That's a positive model. I'm going to assert that describes the world. And now I want to do something normative on top of that model. So I want to think about how do we use a positive model as we use it for a normative question. What's the optimal tariff structure? Jim went through a nice example of that yesterday. We could say, what's the, if we have this combination of using tariffs versus quotas, VER quotas for regulating imports, what's the cost? What's the difference between these different ways of regulating imports? Here I'm going to ask the question, what's the optimal set of taus to minimize the revenue that's received by a particular region? So R hat is going to be the sanctioned region. So we're going to pick one region. We say we want to sanction that region. That means we want to minimize how much revenue they receive for buying armaments. So minimize how much money is made by R hat. And that's going to be the producer price times the quantity. Notice this is an interesting question, primarily when the elasticity of demand is low. Because when the elasticity is low, if we tax the output of the region, that will restrict sales, which means they won't sell as much. That reduces their revenue. But the thing we have to be aware of is if we try to reduce it too much, then that restricts global supply of oil. The demand elasticity is less than 1. The marginal revenue, that's going to cause revenue to go up, right? So it cuts in both ways. So it's not an obvious thing. It's not just like, don't let those bastards sell any oil at all. If you do that, then you can shoot yourself in the foot because you can actually increase their earnings rather than decrease them, right? We're getting it just, and this is a simple intuition. If you went through Jim's examples on monopolistic competition, he's very careful at deriving the marginal revenue function, showing you exactly how this works. If you have this intuition, this is obvious. But what's not obvious here is if we have data about the world as we see it, we have a set of elasticities that describe the world. Ideally, we've estimated those elasticities. If we have that in hand, what's not obvious is how much should we be taxing, right? That's the thing that's not obvious. And that's where you need to have a model for making that point. And the objective here, I just want to point, I didn't put in this link, my favorite link. So I'll do a search for energy modeling model. Hammond. Hammond? I don't see this as a PDF file. So I'll just point you to the paper. We can include this. It's well known that modelers and policy analysts gain access to policy making arenas based on what they know. Critics of models are quick to employ various types of technical standards in evaluating the policy models in order to assess the validity and reliability of claims to knowledge. And what does that mean in this model? The first thing that someone will evaluate this model by is how well do you represent the current flows of crude oil in the world? That's the first thing I'll say is like, what is X bar? So we have to be careful then about getting X bar right. Naive users will only focus on that. Informed users will say, wait a minute, what are the elasticities you're using? Where do those come from? Show me something empirical to justify that. And that's someone who knows economics will focus on how does the model respond, right? What's the response? This article argues that in an effort to make models better, I would say appear better, over-reliance on technical standards misses important political and policy reasons to model. Models call attention to modelers and to their advice, but they always point to mechanisms that could be important. So the purpose of doing this model is not so much to claim that we know the truth, just to point out that, hey, we should think about what's going on here. I can show you different parameterizations where this matters. So even if I don't have an empirical estimate of the elasticities, I can use the model to point out that we have to be a little bit careful and we ought to do some analysis of that, right? So in models use as symbols as claims to authority, whether or not the technical knowledge is technically up to snuff, drawing an experience of energy models. So the important thing to bear in mind is there's this conflict because as a model builder, we have an incentive to make the model as fucking complicated as we can make it to obfuscate so that don't get criticized for making naive assumptions. Because you can hide your assumptions by making the model more complicated. My argument is no, push back on that, make the model as simple as possible, just get at the issues, focus on the issues. So here, for this oil application, yeah, I could use the whole WiNDC framework and have all 50 states, I could get lots of stuff going on, but then I dig myself into a hole. I've got all this complexity going on. I don't know what to assess what's going on. The model I've laid out for you now, I have 3 elasticities to drive the model, and I have 1 matrix of benchmark transactions. At that point, I can say, okay, timeout. What do I get from the model here? And then I can say, okay, well, now I want to build in more detail. I know I want to worry about the elasticities. I want to may worry about whether or not there are other costs going into refining oil. There's different degrees of complexity, and the model is never finished. It's never finished. But the crucial thing is that the model always needs to be operational. Like people say, what's the answer? You always say, well, currently my best estimate is X. And then you're always in the process of thinking, well, how to identify where things are not, what's not right. And then you want to have the model under control. So I'm just pointing you to Hammond because this is important for understanding what you're doing. It's important. And the big problem graduate students have is they don't know what they're doing. They just want to be told this is step A, this is step B. They don't really think about where you're going, but think about like, where am I going with this question? That's the crucial thing. And it comes down to, I come from a family, my father was the consummate engineer. He was trained as a physicist and became an engineer. And my mother then, my brother was an engineer, I was an engineer, my sister essentially is an engineer. So there are like 3 of the 4 kids are engineers essentially. My mother developed a test for engineers, like, are you an engineer or not? So this is her test for engineers. And it goes back to when we used to drive to the beach in the summer. We had like a car with a 6-passenger. My dad was funny because he had a 6-passenger car. It looked like a family car, but it was a Buick Wildcat with an engine that was 454 cubic inches, right? So he was very careful to sell the Buick Wildcat before I got my license. So when I was 15, he sold it. He didn't know that we were taking out the joyride when we were 14, right? So this was a great car. But when we used to drive to the beach, the kids would sit in the back and we always play this game with dad, which was at that time we were driving from Chicago, and you'd always drive by the initial McDonald's thing. And on that McDonald's, they would always have a sign that says 2 million hamburgers sold. And then the next summer you go to the beach, they say 14 million hamburgers sold. Next time you go to the beach, it'd be 27 million hamburgers sold, and then 200 million hamburgers sold. And so the question was always to dad was, 38 million hamburgers, dad, is that enough to, what planet can you reach with 38 million hamburgers, right? Or like, okay, 38 million hamburgers, is that enough to get to the moon or not? So that's Jim's demonstrating he's an engineer from the get-go. If you're an engineer, your immediate response is not like, I don't have a clue. It's not how far is the moon. Your immediate response is back to back or end to end. So then each hamburger is either 2 inches or it's 4 inches, right? So you immediately know like, how big is the hamburger we're talking about? How do we stack it? So that's essentially, that's the crucial thing when you're building models. You have to ask the question, you have to think through what's the question, and you have to think through how do I formulate that, and you got to get to the finish line quickly. And that's, Alex has given us a tool that's superb for that, right? It's superb, right? You get the data, you pour it in. If you know how to build the model, you can build the model. Then you go in to see the boss. He said, okay, with sanctioning of oil, how do we do this? And then immediately you have an answer. And you say, well, there's things I don't know about, but this is how it depends, right? So that's the thing we want to do here. So I want to talk about, want to answer, this was, I was naive. I never took economics as an undergrad, and I took 3 classes in graduate school. And so I learned a lot of economics from Jim Markison, right? This was like, he was always a colleague, but I learned tons from him. And I learned, the first time I saw this question was in the 1992, it was the first time I got to Colorado. We went to the reception for the graduate students. And this was a joke that Jim Alm told I'd never heard before. And I thought, man, that's really smart. So it depends. That's the crucial thing. So the question is, we have to know, how do we set up a model to determine whether it depends or not, right? That's the crucial thing. And so that's what Alex gives us a tool for doing that. And I'm going to, there are many ways to do this. Like there's many ways to do this, but I'm going to show you how to do this in one way. And we're going to use the model that I distributed yesterday. And so what I'm going to begin though by is I'm going to send a file, sanctions.gms. I'm going to say, okay, well, yesterday I distributed the file where the benchmark was randomly selected. And I'm going to basically send you the data. And I'm going to send you data for, and this is one of the things that's I think, underappreciated by CG modelers. It's like, I think that it's a politically incorrect, I no doubt I'll get in trouble, my daughter would like, but there was a group, there was a French graduate student started a group called the PAE Society, called the Post-Autistic Economic Society. And they regarded all economics as being essentially autistic, meaning no matter what we do, we just do the same thing. We just basically take a model off the shelf, we just run that. We want to get beyond that. So we want to basically go to, let's take the question, develop a model, do the question. So here I'm going to send this to Martha and she'll send it around to you. So here I have, I'm still going to use, so I'm going to replace R1 through R4 by a GTAP data set, which is called, we call the G20 data set. That's basically the G20 countries, which has got these guys. So we're going to have France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy split out, but otherwise the rest of the EU. And then we have other oil exporters, low income countries, middle income countries. That's our data set. And we're going to have a target region, which is our US. And they're going to have coalition states being Australia, New Zealand, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Great Britain, USA. Because GAMS was implemented, the first implementation of GAMS was on a Burroughs in machine language, and then he ported it to an IBM 360. And then finally, when Tony Brook came along, the first time it was ported to a code. The first time GAMS saw a machine where there was this distinction between lowercase and uppercase was when the machine code got ported to Turbo Pascal. So GAMS goes back long before, and that's the reason this is in lowercase rather than uppercase, for the same reason that Jim, I can't get Jim to use lowercase. It's because those of us who were originally trained in Fortran, Fortran programmers can write Fortran in any language, and in Fortran, lowercase and uppercase are never distinguished. So that's in GAMS, there's no distinction between lowercase and uppercase. That's right. So you can do it, but GAMS doesn't care. And so there I just made a mistake. I usually would use just one capitalization. So there's those guys, there's some random variations, and there are the benchmark flows. And I was going to say that this is what is oftentimes, I don't think, in my view, these general equilibrium data sets are not used sufficiently for partial equilibrium analysis, because you have all this data sitting there that describes transactions. You can just pull out the data, and it's easy. If you have a flexible modeling language, you can pull out the data and do something quick and dirty without having to carry around all of the details of the model. You can simply grab the data and use it. So here's the data for flows. We can see here. So this has got US sells $300 billion of its own oil it buys from itself. Canada, 38 million. And you can see here, Canada exports to the US nearly twice as much as it uses locally. So almost all the Canadian oil is used in the US. India produces 21 billion. And if I look at where does India, it imports from Saudi Arabia 28 billion. It imports from other oil exporters 58 billion. So here we have the transactions, the crucial transactions for this minimalist model I have. It's what I like about using general equilibrium data sets for doing partial equilibrium models is that we can do a simple model and then we can add complications. Okay, if I want to put in capital cost of refining oil, I've got all the data on the data side, I just have to pull it across. But initially build the simplest model you can. So I'm going to send this data set to Martha. Those of you who have programmed in GAMS before, we'll take a break here for 20 minutes, let you guys program, come back at 10:15. Is that early?
We're supposed to take a break at 10 anyway.
Okay. So I'm going to give you 20 minutes to focus, 15 minutes for coffee. We'll come back 10:30. Yeah. So people, that would be my, or maybe we can give people 45 minutes to mess around with this. So the code we sent yesterday could be combined with this data file. And then this would be to stick the original schedule. That way, if somebody was planning to join us at 10:30, they could come back. And the idea being, I realize that people who are sitting in on the call who have not used GAMS before, this is something you may not have used before. I'd urge you to find someone by Skype or by Zoom you can work with. So those of you who are sitting in and not done this before, but if you have before, this little exercise, tell me what the optimal tax rates are for these elasticity assumptions and for this data set. And then we'll go on from there. What I want to do is to go from here to show how we can use this little model to do sensitivity analysis. And when we come back, I'm going to show how to hook this up with Excel for doing this. So I'm going to say, I'll send this to you, Martha. I don't understand, this thing is always so slow. So that gives folks a data file, and then we'll just let people go ahead. I'll keep my thing open so that just close it. Okay. Okay.
Okay, then we end this first session now. I'll forward you the email and we'll be back at 10:30 as planned.
So you have 45 minutes. Those of you who, I mean, it's very hard without seeing people. It's very hard for me to judge. Are we way beyond? It's hard for me to judge. So I apologize if you're finding this frustrating because we're expecting a lot. But this gives a chance for people to mess around with it. And we'll come back at 10:30. And the first thing I'll do before showing how to use this, I'll field questions from the audience about things, problems you ran into, whatever. Come back and ask me, share your challenges, and we'll do this together. And then I'll go through showing how to set this up. This is just this is sort of basic programming stuff. Okay, so we'll see you guys in 45 minutes. Okay.